morning. Can everyone hear? Yes, it sounds like you can. Thanks very much for being here. We have a terrific group of people to spend the next hour and a half with. We got off to a bit of a late start, and so we'll have a bit of a late finish and still have plenty of time for plenty of questions from you, I hope. My name is Jeff Ball. I'm from Stanford University, formerly from the Wall Street Journal. And I had the pleasure of being here last year as well for this discussion, which proved to be a pretty spirited discussion, and I hope that this one will be as well. I'm going to kind of frame the discussion that we're going to have for a few minutes. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to just jump right into about an hour's worth of discussion and then talk about your questions as well, in the hopes of kind of having a free-flowing debate here without a lot of presentations, which I think should be more interesting. Let me just first outline a few big trends in the global energy industry, all of which we will dig into in some detail today. We've seen a shift in the center of gravity in the global oil industry from the Middle East toward North America with the increase of unconventional oil and gas production, particularly in the United States. A continuing rise in energy consumption, importantly not in the West, where energy consumption is basically flat, but almost exclusively in developing economies like Morocco. A very, very confusing time in the global coal industry, a shift away from coal in the United States and a shift toward coal, more use of coal, particularly in China. And last, perhaps for our purposes today, but certainly not least, a big cost decline in renewable energy, which among other things is sparking fairly significant fights about who wins money and who loses money as renewables ramp up. Those battles are playing out all around the world, in Europe, in China, in the United States, and I dare say here in Morocco, which we will talk about today. What does all that add up to? It adds up to one basic monumental task for the global energy industry, and that is this: to slash global greenhouse gas emissions to the level that many scientists say is necessary to avoid dangerous results from climate change, while at the same time providing the world with the massive increase in energy supply that this planet, particularly the developing world, is projected to need over the next few decades. So I think that points to a key tension, and it's this tension that we're going to talk about today. The tension is between economic development and environmental protection. How does one square those two goals? And more specifically, what is the interplay between developed and developing countries in squaring the tension between economic development and environmental protection? I want to mention two quick facts just this week that were issued by the International Energy Agency that put this into perspective. The International Energy Agency, based in Paris, is essentially kind of the world's repository of conventional wisdom on global energy. And the IEA said two things 2 days ago. First, the IEA said that the world is on track, even under a scenario that envisions pretty aggressive reductions in carbon emissions, to see an average long-term global temperature increase of 3.6 degrees Celsius, which is significantly more than the 2 degrees Celsius that many scientists say the world should try to avoid exceeding. Second, the IEA noted that around the globe, some 1.3 billion people lack access to electricity, and more than 95% of those 1.3 billion people are either in Asia or in sub-Saharan Africa. It's that squaring of those two challenges that we're going to figure out, that we're going to talk about today. Let me just, a couple of housekeeping measures before we jump in. First, we're going to cover a lot of ground today, so we're not going to have speeches, we're going to have just a discussion. Second, I hope you have questions. If at the end of this discussion we have not made you confused or angry or interested, then we will have utterly failed in our enterprise here, and I hope you're jumping out of your seat to ask questions by the time we're done. Third, there are a lot of people here, but you're a broad group, and the world is interested in what's going on here, I hope. So in the interest of technology, I'm going to suggest that if you have your phones with you and they're on, you may want to tweet what's going on here today. You can tweet what's going on here today at hashtag MEDays 2013, MEDAYS 2013. Okay. Without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. We have, I think you'll agree, a really fascinating group of people who are varied both geographically and in terms of their experience. Perhaps they'll be varied as well in their outlook and their ideologies, which we'll get into in a moment. Immediately to my left, we have Abbas al-Naqi, who is Secretary General of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. Before his position at OPEC, he was Undersecretary of Kuwait's oil ministry, and also was head of Kuwait's Climate Change Bureau, and like other people on this panel, has for many years been involved in international climate change negotiations. He's also a member of the Board of Governors of the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. To his left, Evo de Boer, who is currently Special Global Advisor on Climate Change and Sustainability for KPMG. Before that, as many of you know, he was the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a role in which he essentially oversaw international negotiations for many years on agreements about what to do about climate change. Before that, he spent many years in leadership positions in the Dutch Environment Ministry, and he has been, at the end of the day, involved in international climate negotiations for 20 years or so. I think it's fair to say he's won friends and foes on all sides, which I think he will not shy away from. And generally, when one wins foes on all sides, it's an interesting measure of one being sort of in the middle. So we'll jump into that. To Evo's left, we have Andreas Kramer. Andreas is the founder and CEO of the Ecologic Institute, which is based in Berlin. It's a think tank that, among other things, does pretty extensive advisory work to the German government on issues of the environment, and in particular for the discussion today on energy. Andreas has many teaching and lecturing appointments at institutes and universities around the world, including one in my country, the United States, Duke University. And he focuses in those on European environmental policy. Interestingly, Andreas, although he heads an environmental think tank now, was trained in industrial business management in the petrochemical industry. So he has a background that is relevant to other people on this panel. And to his left is Nnimmo BASSEY. Nnimmo is director of the Health of Mother Earth Foundation, based in Nigeria, which is a human rights organization about which Nnimmo will tell you much more. Nnimmo has a long list of international prizes that he's won, among them the Rafto Prize, which is a human rights prize that was that's awarded annually by a Norwegian foundation, and whose prior recipients have included Aung San Suu Kyi. In 2009, Time magazine named Nnimmo one of its heroes of the environment. According to Wikipedia, and you can tell us, Nnimmo, if Wikipedia is right or wrong on this point, Nnimmo was forcibly kept out of the 2009 Copenhagen climate change negotiations. So Evo was inside and Nnimmo was outside. And I will just throw out one thing. I watched a video of Nnimmo, and it was fascinating, but I want to give you one thing that he said, because we'll come back to this in the discussion today. And he said his goal is this: leaving oil in the soil, coal in the hole, and no fracking at all. That's the way we can ensure we have the planet we can recognize and life as humans that we can recognize. So an interesting proposition, and we will dig into that. Now, I know I'm talking a lot, but I want to just talk for about 3 more minutes, and then we'll jump in. What I thought we would do is have a couple of slides that I will whip through from the International Energy Agency, just to put everyone on the same page about essentially the global energy challenge. And then I will stop talking, and these folks will do the talking. Let me make sure that this will work. Do you see? Excellent. So, to be clear, these are slides from the International Energy Agency from a year ago, not from the report that came out Tuesday, but from a year ago. But broadly, the trends are similar. And I just want to whip through these very, very quickly. Oh, can you hear me now? Good. I just want to whip through these very quickly to give you a sense of some key trends. This is global carbon dioxide emissions from energy projections through 2035 compared to today. The light orange is today, the dark orange is 2035. And what do you see? I think you see 2 basic things. You see the developed world, the United States, the European Union, and Japan, anticipated to have a reduction in CO2 emissions over the next 20 years. And you see what's generally called the developing world or emerging economies, obviously of which Morocco is one, expected to increase significantly their CO2 emissions. Effectively, all of the increase in CO2 emissions over the next decades is expected to come from the developing world, not the developed world. And you see particularly China, whose anticipated increase in emissions is greater than the anticipated decrease in emissions from the rest of the world combined. Coal, a similar story. Look at, you see the red is power generation from coal today. The gray is the anticipated change over the next 20 years. What do you see? You see an anticipated reduction in coal-fired power generation in Europe, the United States, and the rest of the OECD. And you see an increase elsewhere, particularly in China, you'll see, and look, other non-OECD countries, including Morocco, that vastly outweighs the decrease in the wealthy world. This is the same story in virtually every kind of energy source, and that's what we're going to whip through very, very quickly here. This is oil demand growth, and again, you see anticipated reductions in oil demand in much of the developed world and big increases in the developing world. You see, just for the purposes of today's discussion, have a look at the Middle East and Africa. Quite significant increases proportionately to where they are today. Nuclear, same thing, although a little bit more nuanced here, and this is particularly interesting. Look at the light line. The light blue is today. The dark blue is 20 years from now. Look at China. Virtually no nuclear now. And look at the expected increase in nuclear production in China. Massive, massive, massive. Vastly outweighs any expected decline elsewhere in the world. And notably, you'll look at Europe, which is anticipated to have a reduction in nuclear, but a massive change in this source. Natural gas, about which we will talk more. I just want you to look at one thing, and that is the Middle East bar, second to the bottom. Look at the expected increase in gas-fired electricity generation in the Middle East, more than doubling. And look also at the top bar, Africa, effectively a doubling in Africa as well. Quite significant. Okay, renewable energy, and then we're almost done. This is a very complicated slide. All I want to talk about for the purposes of today is other non-OECD, the bottom lines. And what you see is that renewable energy today is almost exclusively hydro, and you see a much more multicolored line in 2035, a greater diversification, and I think what's important to remember here is that renewables are still anticipated to be a minority of the total electricity pie, but to grow significantly off a fairly small base, and that and each of those little slices of color is a pretty massive economic opportunity for people. A lot of people will make money, and a lot of people will lose money, and we will talk about that today. Okay, a couple more. We're going to have a fairly deep discussion here about climate change, and I want to crystallize the tension here, and in particular, I want Evo to talk more about this. This is from the IEA, and essentially what this is a chart of where global CO2 emissions are going. The red line is the anticipated increase in emissions if the world continues on a business-as-usual path. Forget, for the purposes of this discussion, the blue and the orange line. Let's just look at the green line. The green line is what scientists tell us the world will have to do to avoid dangerous consequences from climate change. I'm vastly oversimplifying, but that's basically it. So between the red line and the green line, there is a massive gap. And what I want you to look at is the right side, the line on the right side. And the question is, who bears the burden for that gap? The light purple is OECD countries, wealthy countries. The dark purple is non-OECD countries, developing countries, emerging countries, obviously of which Morocco is one. And what does this tell you? It tells you that if the world moves from the red line to the green line, itself not at all a certain proposition. It will not be the West, it will not be the rich world that will bear the brunt of that burden. It will be the poorer countries. And I think that crystallizes the kind of impasse that we're at in terms of global climate negotiations. We'll get into that much more. Okay, I'm going to go through this quickly, but this is basically on a per capita basis what would happen to emissions. And I just want you to look at my own country, the green line. This is the United States. If the world were to get to that green line in the prior slide, this is what would happen to per capita, per person emissions. It would be quite a change, I think it's fair to say, in the life of everyone in this room, particularly in the lives of Americans who are consuming it at a higher rate. And we're done. So I just wanted to kind of frame this discussion. So let's jump in here, and the first thing I want to do is ask each of these guys to talk about where around the world they see particularly interesting changes happening in terms of energy. Pick one place that strikes you as particularly noteworthy, and talk not just about what is happening, but about why you think it's happening, because I think drivers are really important to this discussion. Who wants to jump in? Who wants to start? Andreas.
Thank you, Jeff. For one, the change is not going to happen in the International Energy Agency. It's great to use their slides to start this panel. But the IEA is wrong for 3 reasons. One is this is about the future, and you cannot really be right about the future. The second reason is methodological. They use models, and if you look at how models are constructed, they need to have continuous equations within them. They're unable to model disruption. You cannot model disruption. You need different techniques for doing that, and the IEA can't do that. They're methodologically not equipped to understand what the energy system could do if we stimulate it sufficiently. And the third problem is political. The IEA is populated by people who are deeply embedded in the nuclear and in the fossil industries. They don't want to think about anything but a positive future for their sectors, which is why I think the IEA gets it all wrong. Where is the change happening? In Japan, fastest phase out of nuclear power. In Germany, that is a very strategic long-term project on phasing out nuclear and phasing out fossils, and it is the third innovation center in the world is the west coast of the United States with the IT technology, the smart grid technology. It is really a Pacific innovation center, the partnership between California, Japan, Taiwan, and China. That's the interesting story there.
Why do you think change is happening in those? Just talk for a moment about Germany. Why? Why is change happening in Germany?
Germans have decided they want anything but nuclear after Chernobyl, and they decided a little bit later that they wanted to do their best to phase out fossil energy. So those are the 2 core objectives. They're nothing new. It's something that has grown over decades. Why is that? Because Germans, although they are a nuclear technology provider, they're not a military nuclear power. So you could actually question the risk, the economics, the health effects of nuclear power without being accused of sedition. You can't criticize nuclear power in France because automatically you are unpatriotic, you're a traitor, and you have those reflexes. You don't have them in Germany. The second one is that Germans have lost their sense of nationality. We don't have a nationality. We have a citizenship of a state. Staatsbürgerschaft is the German word. And Germans, perhaps as a result of the violent history of the 20th century, we've learned to be global citizens. So think about the solutions that the globe needs and then develop the technologies, develop the products, the services, and with those solutions then do good around the world, but also earn money with it because we like to export things.
Eva, why don't you jump in? Yeah.
Well, your question was, where do you see change happening? And I want to mention a place which probably most people don't expect me to mention, which is China. I think we're in a situation now in China where you cannot breathe the air in the cities, where sometimes the air quality norm is 50 times what is prescribed by the World Health Organization. You can't drink the water out of the rivers anymore. In fact, the water is so polluted that you can't even use it for agricultural purposes anymore. And the ecosystems in China, including agriculture, are completely devastated. Partly as a consequence of that, global resources are being sucked into China. Maybe some of you saw this in the newspapers, that a few months ago, China basically bought 1/4 of the Ukraine in order to secure agricultural supply going into the future. And the story in the north of Africa on agricultural land, on forests and minerals is pretty much the same. So all of the global resources are being sucked into China. And my sense is that there is a strong perception politically and societally in China that this cannot continue, that you cannot continue to grow the Chinese economy at 8-9% per year using the current model. But the Chinese economy has to continue to grow, because in China there are hundreds of millions of people still living in rural areas in extreme poverty. So on the one hand, you have a challenge of an environment that is going to pieces and sucking up world resources, and at the same time, the challenge to lift people out of poverty. And I believe that there is a very strong realization in China, not just because of energy and not just because of climate, but more broadly, that a different economic model has to be found, that a different way forward has to be found. And everything that I read in the current Chinese 5-year plan and in the intentions of the political leaders is all about taking the Chinese economy in a different direction on climate, on energy, on water, on how resources are used, to basically make that economy fit for the future. We've seen the beginnings of that on investments in solar, in wind, in battery technology, in solar cities. Across the board, I won't go on too long, we're at the beginning of that journey. And yes, the journey is only just beginning, and a lot of very polluting things are happening in China. But if you ask me, what is the most staggering signal of change that you see, I would mention China.
Excellent. Nnimmo, do you want to jump in?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Amadeus Institute for having me in Morocco. It's my first visit, and I'm just so much in love with the country. Now, I would rather speak about my disappointment that the world is not shifting away from fossil fuels, exploitation, and usage. Now, the world has been on the path of fossil fuel civilization for close to 2 centuries, and it's driving us to the brink of disaster. But we see more and more investment in this dirty energy source and less in alternative energies that would actually take us out of the path of destruction. I note that the major driver is the lure of money, capital. The proven reserves of fossil fuels amount to about $28 trillion. So the oil-rich nations, including my country, Nigeria, and the powerful corporations cannot just see $28 trillion and they fold their hands. So they lock in this kind of extraction, and they don't really care what happens to the planet, what happens to humanity. And when we see disasters like Haiyan in the typhoon in Philippines or the cyclone in Somalia, people say, okay, let's throw in a few coins, let's send food, which is very good. Humanitarian help is very good, but why don't we do the fundamental thing that would take us away from the path of disaster? This is my disappointment.
So what would change look like to you?
Well, you know, what we need to do, we have enough resources in the world, we have enough manpower, we have the brains, the knowledge. We need to, and this is very urgent, we need to move into renewables. Renewable will help, we need to democratize the energy space. Every nation has access to renewables. We don't have to have only a few nations having resources that they hold the rest of the country, the rest of the world to ransom, but something that everyone can have access to, and so that when countries if they don't develop the renewables, or it's more expensive for them to develop it, they can negotiate with others who can do it a bit cheaper. So we need to open up this space and move away from fossils. To me, that's number one thing that must be done. Move away from fossils, not dig deeper. Now we're talking about peak oil, that oil is going to run out. We know oil will run out eventually. But now we're having more extreme ways of extraction. And countries like the United States are now saying, okay, we're going to become a net exporter because we can frack. And then environmental agencies say, we're not so sure if this is polluting the water bodies. But, you know, these are the things that we need to look at and unpack. And we don't need to, because of uncertainties, refuse to move in the direction that we ought to move.
So Abbas al-Naqi, I think that's a good setup for you, which is the proposition that the contention that the world needs to shift entirely away from fossil fuels, from oil and other fossil fuels to renewables, and the notion that essentially nothing is happening in that direction now. Is that a fair framing of this? And if it's not, why not? And I guess more specifically, where, in your view, if you think things are happening, are they happening most notably?
Shall I talk in Arabic or in English? Is it okay? English or Arabic?
Whatever you prefer. Whichever you prefer.
Anyway, okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. في البداية أود أن أتقدم خالص الشكر إلى سعادة الأخ إبراهيم الفاسي الفيري لدعوتنا لهذا المؤتمر الهام جدا وللمرة الثانية وللأخوة والأخوات في اللجنة التنظيمية لهذا المؤتمر. ونشكرهم جدا على هذه الحفاوة وهذا الاستقبال. للعودة إلى سؤال Jeff, thank you again for your very kind introduction at the beginning, and regarding your question you've asked, we believe that still there will be a great demand on fossil fuel, although, as you mentioned here and you said, the growth of all other kinds of energies. But of course, we still believe that it will be by 2035, the percentage of the demand on fossil fuel will be about 54 to 55%. And the major part of that will be, of course, oil and gas. That time. So there is no doubt or we have full confidence that although there is some other kinds of energies are coming into the market, such as shale oil and gas oil and others, and also renewables, but the fossil fuel in general, will keep its position as the main part of the energy in the future. And yes, maybe the share of fossil fuel will be decreased a little bit from 32 to 27 or something like that, but still it will be the higher part or the higher share of the energy in the future. This is from, of course, all forecast studies and the predictions that were made by IEA, OPEC, and other specialized offices and parties.
And you think that that's the case indefinitely into the future, as far as one can project?
Yes, I think even if there is, of course, we have to go for other kinds of energy, as my colleague said just before, shifting to the renewables. But renewables is not a replace for oil and gas. It is a complement. So when we have oil, gas, and other oil kinds of alternative source of energy, that will be a part of the total energy in the world in the future.
So let's actually, I was going to get to this later, but let's just keep this bit of the discussion going. And someone react to that. Is that something with which you all agree, that renewables are not a replacement for oil and gas, that structurally that's simply not reasonable? Andreas, you want to jump in?
Two things. One is, if indeed all the fossil fuel that we have in the ground is burned, then we can forget food supply from the oceans. We talk about climate change. The more interesting story is the acidification of the oceans and the loss of the food web, the biodiversity in the oceans, and we are going to lose that protein source, in addition to all the destruction on the land. So even if there was a possibility of maintaining oil and coal and fossil methane from fracking in the energy system, we should not do so. Second one is, we now have technologies to convert electricity from wind power, for example, into gas, power to gas, or into liquids, power to liquid. Both of those technologies allow the countries that invest in renewable energy to produce the hydrocarbons themselves as feedstock for their chemical industry and as liquid fuels for the transport sector. If they want to do that, we can hang on to the hydrocarbon economy without using the fossil hydrocarbons that are in the ground. They need to stay there.
Ivo and Nnimmo, both you wanted to jump in, so whoever of you wants to jump in first. Nnimmo, you had your hand up first.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, go
ahead. The economic arguments for staying with fossil fuels is always very fascinating to me, and I do agree that going by the current ways that the mathematics is being done and the way policy is being done, that really the fossil fuels appear to bring a lot of revenue to governments and also to oil corporations. But what is not counted is the impact on the environment and the impact on the planet. Fossil fuels appear to be a cheap source of energy, but really because nobody's paying the price except the poor people who are living in the oil fields, who are subsidizing the rich and the privileged, who are enjoying the revenue from fossil fuels. If I give an example for my country, it's mind-boggling what has happened in the oil fields of the Niger Delta. Over 55 years of oil exploration, all the revenue we've made from oil, when it's time to clean up, I don't think we're going to be able to clean up or restore some places. Some of the places are actually dead. But what worries me more about the fact that we could stay with fossil fuels till 2035 at such a high percentage is that the World Bank and the International Energy Agency have told us at the report that came out before Doha, before last year, was that unless about 80% of known reserves of fossil fuels are left in the soil untouched, we're not going to ever think of keeping to about less than 2 degrees centigrade temperature increase. And what that means for Africa, if there's for every 1 degree that must be Shell or Exxon Mobil. Now, for every 1 degree temperature increase, Africa suffers 50% more than any other part of the world. So we're going to have 2 degrees centigrade temperature increase above pre-industrial levels. Africa will have 3 degrees. If we have 4 degrees, Africa will have 6 degrees. Now, Africa is already so heavily challenged by global warming, droughts, food shortages, water scarcity. If this is allowed to happen, then Africa has been sentenced to death. And this is why I think it's a desperate situation that requires urgent action. Even though we can still drill, let's stop drilling.
Thank you. If it's possible to get a second microphone up here, that would be terrific. So I want Evo to jump in here, but I want to focus how you jump in here. And I want Nnimmo referred to what's a quite interesting and extraordinarily controversial premise that is gaining a lot of currency in kind of policy and economic circles. And this is the notion that if the world burns all or a significant portion of the reserves of fossil fuels that it currently has, there will be big problems for the climate, and therefore, among other things, investors should discount their valuation of fossil fuel companies on the assumption that a good portion of the reserves that fossil fuel companies have and on which their market valuations have been based are immaterial because they're not going to be allowed to be burned. And Evo, I want you to feel free to jump in any way that you want, but in particular, you do a lot of consulting with companies, and I'm particularly curious whether that notion is gaining much currency among the clients you're working with.
Well, I think my first point would be whether we're going to run out of fossil fuels or not is an absolute non-discussion. I mean, we've been talking about oil and gas, but we have enough coal to cook this planet 8 times over. So running out of fossil fuels is a complete non-issue. Secondly, I would agree that oil and gas are going to remain a significant and growing part of the energy mix, if only because we have 1.3 billion people who have no access to modern energy sources, and they would love to have that. And secondly, we have 1.3 billion people who are living on less than $1 a day, and they would like to have a little bit more to spend, so global economies are going to grow. I think what Nnimmo has pointed to very correctly is that we need to redefine the value of things, that we need to redefine how you price things. We as KPMG produced a report about a year ago. It was called Expect the Unexpected, Building Business Value in a Changing World, where we looked at 11 what we called global megaforces on climate, energy, food, water, biodiversity, ecosystems loss, material price increases, and then population growth, urbanization, and wealth increase. And we looked at what would be the impact on different sectors of the economy of those global trends. And then went on to ask ourselves the question, what would happen if you were to gradually internalize the environmental cost that is related with all of those trends into the price of different products and into the price of doing business? And what we found was that across the board, industry would see about 40% of its profits wiped out if it had to internalize all of those environmental costs. And we found that the food and beverage industry would lose about 200% of its profits because of the enormous impact that they have on the environment, on energy, etc. In other words, and this is what Nnimmo, I think, is pointing to, is that at the moment, when we talk about price, we talk about the price of the commodity itself, but we leave out of the equation entirely the broader cost to society. So in the case of fossil fuels, you have perhaps revenue going to an oil ministry, but the cost is ending up with the health ministry, the agriculture ministry, the environment ministry, in fact with society as a whole. And the general trend that I see slowly beginning is that we are beginning to understand that broader concept of cost better and to integrate it into economics more strongly. And the leading businesses that I work with around the world get that and are trying to adjust their business models so that they create growth in areas that accommodate that change.
And to this point about the notion of discounting the valuation of a company whose valuation is based largely on fossil fuel reserves, does that strike you as a notion that's just marginal and tangential, or does that strike you as a notion that the clients you're working with take seriously?
Well, the clients that I work with take that very seriously, not just in terms of carbon. I think most companies expect there to be a price on carbon, and many companies, including in the energy sector, including in the fossil fuel sector, are actually asking for a price on carbon. But I think that there is the broader realization that costs need to be internalized and that serious businesses are turning that into a business opportunity.
So, thank you. So I want to turn this discussion now to this tension that I outlined at the start, which was the tension between economic development on the one hand and environmental improvement on the other, and more specifically in emerging economies like Morocco and economies around it, how one tries to implement, Eva, what you're articulating, and how one, Nnimmo, in a place like many countries in Africa, which as you say, are feeling the effects of development of energy resources over the years, how one shifts in a way that's affordable, not affordable just to the United States and to Germany, but affordable around the world. So, Abbas al-Naqi, let's start with you. To what extent do you see the kind of change that people on this panel are talking about playing out in poorer parts of the world in a way that's actually affordable in poorer parts of the world? Or does it strike you that the discussion that we're having here is not realistic in the context of people who are earning $1 a day or not much more?
Thank you very much. But before that, the question is realistic, actually. But what is strange in here that when we talk about the three elements themselves, when we talk about the fossil fuel, the production of fossil fuel, and also about the relationship between the climate change and fossil fuel, and also the sustainable development, all these three items and elements are, we look at them from the angle that we want to talk about. So, in the climate change issue, of course, as many of us here, and also Mr. Boer, he was our colleagues, and he was in charge of that. So, in some industrialized countries, they are trying to decrease dependence on fossil fuel, mainly oil and gas, as you know, oil, let's say. At the same time, they subsidize coal. Coal is the most energy which makes which pollute the environment.
To be clear, you're talking about industrialized countries that are subsidized.
I thought yes. The subsidies in the countries which produce coal, and also there are some agreements and such as energy treaty. The UE and EU, I mean, and others, they put targets to reduce dependence for the next 30 years ahead. So that will, of course, that will decrease the dependence on fossil fuel. At the same time, we hear that there should be the security of supply from now on. And of course, when we say this words, the security of supply, we say always, and we concentrate the security of demand, because when we when we invest billions of dollars in such the industry, and in the future there will not be any demand on that. So of course this is just a waste of money and waste of time and waste of efforts. So all these three items: sustainable development, energy, fossil fuel, and also the other the climate change issue. They should be all interrelated to each other, and to look at each of them, the interest of each group of countries.
So you're drawing a distinction between security of supply on the one hand and the kind of environmental issues that people on this panel are talking about. Just to be clear, your sense is that there is a distinction, that in order to have security of energy supply, it's not possible to move forward with the kind of agenda that other people on this panel are talking about. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's right, unless there is a security of demand. There should be a security of demand, and assure that your oil, your crude, and for those countries which highly depend on one source of energy, such as oil and gas, for their development and for sustainable, they should be safe from that point.
Okay, so I see Andreas and Ivo are about to jump out of their seats, so we're going to let them, or at least Andreas is, so we're going to let them, perhaps Nnimmo too. But I want to just define a term. So the term was security of demand. And I think it's important for us to understand what Abbas Naqi means by that, and please correct me if I'm wrong. But essentially the notion is security on the part of energy-producing states, that if they make the capital investment to produce more energy, there will be reliable demand so that they can amortize the cost of those investments over time. And the question, I guess, that you're raising is, if the world is changing policies such that you're not persuaded that there's going to be continuing demand, you're less likely to invest in that supply. Okay, who wants to jump? Andreas, you want to jump in, and then, okay, all of you, yeah.
I don't think it would matter if you stopped investing, because so much investment is already in the ground that we can extract from that the fossil fuels that we will need for the few decades until we have succeeded in the transition towards renewable energy. The illusion is not only that fossil fuels are cheap because we are not accounting for the environmental damage and the social cost of them, but there's also an illusion because we always look at the barrel of crude oil, at the price, or of the cubic meter of gas or something like that. But the fossil fuel needs to be processed, it needs to be transported. And in the remote communities, in the 1.2 million people who have no access to modern forms of energy, they're remote. The cost of operating a diesel power generator in the Arctic North, on an island state somewhere in a tropical island, in a rural village in India or in Africa, the cost of operating that is way higher than the alternative production of electricity from renewable energy in small independent grids. It's the economics that will kill the fossil industry, and the sooner they understand, the better it is.
I want us to be very specific in this discussion, because these discussions of relative economics of energy sources often take place at a kind of 30,000-foot level. And if we're going to talk about the relative economics, let's try to use some numbers here about what your sense is of what is competitive and what is not competitive, and where different sources of energy around the world are more competitive and not. So I just want to inform this with a little bit of detail. Yeah, do you want to jump on that, and then we'll go to Ivo. You had your hand up next, and then Nnimmo. Go ahead.
Renewable energies are already competitive in many parts of the world a lot of the time. Onshore wind is competitive in many different economies. Solar power is competitive now. They are on downward cost digressions.
Solar power is competitive with subsidy in a very small number of places, right?
No. Solar power in Germany is competitive against the retail price of electricity. So it makes sense for anybody to put solar panels, as you can see here, on their roofs and stop buying expensive power from the utilities. It is economic. It is a runaway economic success now. You can't stop it anymore.
Okay. Ivo.
I'm lost. Where are you?
Well, you raised we were talking about security of energy supply, and that being not consistent with the notion of switching to other energy sources. And you looked like you wanted to say something about that.
Yeah, but then you moved on to security of demand, and I think actually that's something that I want to respond to, because
Please.
I believe there is no such thing as security of demand. I've mentioned this to you before, but in 1896, there was an urban planning conference in London in the United Kingdom. And the conclusion of that conference was that the biggest challenge of the 20th century was going to be horse manure. Because as more and more people got more and more money, they would be buying horses and carriages, and all of the manure would pile up in the streets, and you wouldn't be able to go anywhere. And along came the internal combustion engine and fundamentally changed the landscape. So I do not think that there is such a thing as security of demand. I think there is security of demand for energy in general, but not for a particular type of energy. And the cost landscape of energy is changing in general and in different geographies. I would agree with Andreas that in many parts of the world, renewables are already competitive with fossil fuel generated power. In other parts of the world, that will take longer because coal is abundantly available and very cheap. So it's important to look at this, I think, to not expect security of demand, and to look at this in a nuanced way and recognize that different energy carriers are going to be appropriate in different geographies at different moments of time.
Okay, thank you. Nnimmo, please jump in.
Is it working? Okay. This work. All right, thank you. I just want to comment on the issue of security of energy supply. Now, with regard to fossil fuels, this is imposed by military power in the world. And so the supply is enforced, whether the supplier wants to supply it or not. And we have examples of this clearly in the oil-rich regions of the world. And this is why it's also shocking that in terms of global tackling climate change, the world, right from Copenhagen, is finding it difficult to find resources, funds for the Green Climate Fund. Whereas in 2011, for example, the rich countries spent $1.7 trillion in war, military engagements. And we're looking for $100 billion by 2020 for Green Climate Fund, and this is hardly coming forth.
Explain, just to define terms, explain what the Green Carbon Fund is briefly.
Well, the Green Climate Fund, I think Ivo would speak more about this, is the fund being created by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to provide funds that would help to tackle for mitigation and adaptation in poorer, more vulnerable countries, which is something that is so urgent. And $100 billion is so small compared to the damage being done already to regions by climate impacts. In fact, I believe right now in Warsaw, they talk about there's a lot of resistance to loss and damage, compensation. And a country like the U.S. believes that, the other countries are going to be asking for money from us, and we don't want that. This kind of posture locks in the damaging energy paradigm while at the same time running away from tackling the outcome. And, if I just give one example again about economic relationship, economic development and environmental protection. Now, the fossil fuel sector is destroying local livelihoods, destroys fisheries, destroys farming for poor communities. And so when this sector provides 2,000 jobs, for example, 1 million jobs are wiped out. But if we shift to renewables or other environmentally friendly energy sources, you're going to create new jobs, new opportunities, workers will be more freer in communities. There'll be a real social change, and this is what we need in the world today.
So this is worth spending a moment on, and at least Nnimmo and Abbas and Naqi, I'd like you both to address this. Is it your sense, and we're speaking hugely simplistically and broadly here, but is it your sense that in Africa or in the Middle East, there's a general acceptance of the notion that you've just articulated, that a shift from fossil fuels to other energy sources is net a good thing for the places where you live? Or is it your sense that that's a difficult argument to make, and that in fact the prevailing sense is what we need is not green energy but cheap energy, and cheap energy is the energy we've got today? And in other words, do you feel like you're fighting an uphill fight, or do you feel like the wind is at your back? And I'd like your sense of that, particularly in the Middle East. Nnimmo? Nnimmo, do you want to jump in on that first?
I think it's a mix. We don't want energy that's necessarily, we don't want the cheapest energy, we want a safe energy. We need to also define what energy do we need. Do we need as much as we need now? When I go to rich countries, I see how much energy they use. I mean, it's immoral. That's the way I would describe it. Because people are wasting energy, whereas others don't have it. So we need to, how much energy do we need? What do I need energy for? This is the issue. We need to redefine our relationship with energy. Do you enjoy seeing the night sky, or must we see electricity all the time?
Mr. Naqi, could you just address this question, particularly in the Middle East, the view of the economics of shifting energy sources?
Yes, of course, we believe that there should be a little bit shift also from fossil fuel and also to the renewables and others. And also there are some evidence in the area. If we look at the UAE, United Arab Emirates, they have one full city which is called Masdar. It works without any emissions, as you know. And also for the metro, they are doing that. In Egypt, they are doing well, and in Saudi Arabia, they are in King Abdullah. There are some trials to move from the traditional crude oil or energy to the. Of course, and also there are big projects for the solars, for the solar energy and wind, and also in the North Africa, in many countries in Morocco, and they are trying to shift to solar and wind and geothermal and well. We believe that renewables are part of the total energy, but of course it does not replace alternative to that. It is not alternative, but it is, as we said in the beginning, it is a complement to the traditional energy.
Okay, excellent.
But if you allow me just one point regarding the security of demand, and of course when we talk about the security of supply, we have to be very careful, and there is which is called the security of demand for the billions of dollars which
you've already invested.
Which have been invested in that, and you have to be sure that those billions of dollars, you will have the return to that in the future.
So we are clearly not going to solve this debate today, but I think what we've established is that the debate clearly is underway, and this question of where the money goes, who wins and who loses, is sort of central to this whole discussion. Okay, I want to shift. We're going to open this up to your questions in perhaps 10 minutes. But I want to talk a little bit about negotiations over climate change, because I think that's been hanging in the background here, and I want to try to address it head on. We're sitting here on November 14th, and in the middle of Europe in Warsaw, diplomats from around the world are gearing up for the next 10 days of international climate negotiations. And anyone on this panel can correct me if they think I'm wrong, but I think it's fair to say that expectations are low for a grand deal on climate. We have on this panel many, or at least two veterans of many international climate discussions. And I guess the first question I want to ask about this is pretty basic, which is, why have these international discussions on climate change failed to produce what at least was articulated at the goal at the outset, which was a kind of grand global agreement on climate change? Or is that an unfair question? Evo, why don't you jump in? You're perhaps the longest veteran of that and have been on the inside the most.
Well, you said the climate change negotiations had failed to deliver on the goal, and I think that part of the problem is that certainly in the run-up to Copenhagen, that big climate change conference in 2009, there was no clear agreed the goal. Different people wanted different things, and it's very difficult to negotiate when you don't understand what you're negotiating. Then you said that expectations for Warsaw, the current negotiation, are low, but that depends on what you expect to come out of that conference. And I think that nobody expects a fantastic new treaty to come out of this particular conference. They hope that magic is going to happen in Paris in 2015. So for me, the meeting now in Warsaw would be very successful if it does something very simple, which is to agree a roadmap on how to get to a big party in Paris in 2015. The process at the moment, I think, is in intensive care, in the sense that...
That is the entire global negotiating process over a climate change agreement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, you know, people had enormous expectations for Copenhagen 2 years ago. Many people, even the people that do not drink alcohol, came away from Copenhagen with a terrible hangover in terms of where the politics were going. You've seen many politicians back away from climate change. You've seen many politicians be completely preoccupied with the economic crisis, the financial crisis, some with the Eurozone crisis. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, who used to be a great leader on climate change, used to be the German Environment Minister, now only talks about Greece. She doesn't talk about climate anymore. So one of the things that needs to happen, and this goes to Nnimmo's point on political will, is that the political will needs to come back into the climate change process.
You talked, we had a chat last night about this, and you used a metaphor that I thought was really interesting, and it had to do with 5 guys on a ledge. Why don't you explain that to people here and how you see that as explaining what's happening or not happening in climate change negotiations?
Well, people think that that the climate change process is about climate change, and it is to some extent. But what it really is about is about economics, about putting your economy on the line. And for me, it's very much, imagine 5 men or 3 women and 2 men standing on the ledge of a 20-story building. And they know that if all 5 of them jump, that an air cushion will open and they will all be safe. But they also know that if one of them doesn't jump, then the air cushion is not going to open, and whoever has jumped will come to a very messy end. So people are very reluctant to jump because they don't have the confidence that everyone else will, and that therefore the air cushion will open and they'll all be safe. So you see people looking at each other, and I find it fascinating to see President Obama, who is still the president of the most powerful country in the world, issued a climate memorandum from the White House in July. And the second paragraph of that climate memorandum says, the United States is willing to reduce its emissions by blah, blah, blah %. And here it comes. The United States is willing to reduce its emissions by blah, blah, blah %, providing other countries do the same. So part of the problem with the climate process is they're all on the ledge, they're all waiting for each other, nobody is willing to jump. And what the climate regime has to do is to find a way for everybody to jump together. Maybe not the same height, maybe not at the same time, but that there is a sense that everybody is engaging.
So we're going to move into questions soon, but I want to put this question to all of you who want to join in, and it is not what you hope will happen, but what you think will happen. To what extent might there be something that will come out of this process or any other process that would lead all 5 of those people to jump? And if so, what would that look like? And just jump in, Andreas, you're shaking your head.
One thing I think is that the latest assessment report of the International Panel on Climate Change needs digesting, not only by the experts, they know it already, but many of the policymakers, because the 5 people standing on the ledge, they will understand that if they stay there, they're going to be cooked. They have no choice but to somehow get off that ledge. So it's a question, do you jump or do you build a parachute or whatever else you do? You can't stay there. The second thing is that... Just
to be clear, you think it is absolutely true that all 5 on the ledge believe that?
Look at what the IPCC assessment report from Working Group 1 says. It says practically certain that climate change is happening and that it is human-induced. Second, it's going to happen much faster, and the consequences are so much more devastating than they wrote in the previous report 7 years ago. Third, it's not really the overheating of the planet, it's the acidification of the oceans that is going to kill us first. It's going to deny us of a resource base, protein base, very quickly. So there's a whole change in the emphasis. It creates new urgency and inescapability of it all that tells the people on the ledge is that staying there is not an option. That changes the equation in negotiating with the other four whether to jump or not. The second thing that we are learning, and this is something I as a German experience, is jumping actually is pleasurable. When you do that, when you decarbonize your economy, that is when you create jobs, when you create new opportunities, tax revenue goes up. It's not subsidy finance, it's actually beneficial for the treasury. There was a recent study by PricewaterhouseCoopers that looked at the historical evidence of 5 European countries, 6 European countries, in what happened to their economies as they decarbonized through the last decades. The experience is pleasurable. There's so many benefits. I don't believe that if you jump, you die at the bottom. There needs to be no cushion. There is a pool of water that's going to capture you and it's going to feel well down there.
Nnimmo and Abbas Naqi, I want you both comment on this however you'd like, but what I'd really like you to do is to address this question of whether, again, in your parts of the world, you believe the notion that there is a general sense that one needs to act. Do you find lately, as opposed to a couple of years ago, that attitudes toward action on climate change have changed markedly? Apart from what you would like to see, what do you in fact see? Nnimmo, you want to jump in?
To think that if a roadmap is prepared,
the wind is competing with you, by the way.
Towards 2015, that would be progress being made in Warsaw. I think this, to me, it would be, if we have to look forward to 2015 before we can move an inch, that would be a big failure from Warsaw. Because climate...
Just to be clear, what you're saying is that if it were just a roadmap that came out of Warsaw, that would be a failure.
Yes, that's a big failure, because 2015 is so far into the future and impacts are so heavy now. We have a planetary emergency. We can't kick the can down two years down the road. But this is what has been going on because we are not able to act globally. When negotiators get to these conferences, they're acting from narrow national interest. We have to find a way to act globally as global citizens and nations. And this happens very easily with civil society, with mass movements outside of the conferences. People forget which countries they came from, and they draw up action plans for what needs to be done. But once politicians gather inside the air-conditioned room with all the computers and the brackets on the screen, they just forget what the reality is outside of the hall. And we need to find a way to get the inside to hear what is going on outside.
So, but just to come back to the question, in Nigeria and around Nigeria, do you sense that what Andreas said is accurate? Apart from what you want, do you sense that there's a change in what you'd call willingness to do something that would, in your view, be significant on climate change, or do you think it's still not changing?
Within Nigeria, the move is very slow because the thing that ought to be done is not being done. I tell you one. Every year in the oil fields, over $2 billion worth of gas, natural gas, is just burnt and wasted. Now, that's not just economic loss. It's a massive contribution of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, compounding the climate problem. So as long as the Nigerian government allows gas flaring to go in the gas fields, whatever else is done to me is nothing.
Okay. Mr. Naqi.
Thank you. The issue of climate change, and since and why until now we did not reach to an end for that process, and this is the COP19, which is being held right now in Warsaw in Poland, but since COP1 and also before that in the Rio 1992, the Air Summit, and until now we are still negotiating to reach to such a agreeable paper or convention among ourselves. And that's, I believe, that's because of two major elements. The first one is the UNFCCC, which is the climate change, United Nations Framework on Climate Change. Itself, it is not purely environmental. It is for environment and also political and also economical, commercial, all these elements are including to the, but it shows us an environmental issue, the climate change. Climate change is plus the environment issue. It is also economic and political. Yep. The other point is because there are so many differences in a group of countries' interests. Each countries or each group of countries, they have their own interests and they are defending their own interests. So for that reason, we did not reach to an agreement until now, and still negotiating. And after UNFCCC, there was Kyoto Protocol, and after Kyoto Protocol, and now another process. But until now, and we shall go on and on until we don't know how many COPs we shall reach.
And I guess that's precisely my question, which is, indeed, it's obvious. It's obviously an economic issue, a political issue, but even more than a political issue, fundamentally an economic issue. And I'm just wondering whether you see any movement that you would regard as significant toward any common agreement, or forget a kind of common diplomatic agreement, any agreement that among even a small group of countries that would amount to significant action on climate change, or do you see those economic fissures as strong today as they were 15 years ago? Do you sense that, I mean, Andreas made the point that he thinks that the 5 people on the ledge have what's changed is he thinks the 5 people on the ledge now believe, I don't know what your word was, but now believe that they're going to suffer significant consequences from climate change in a way that they did not believe that some years ago. Do you see that, or do you think that that's wishful thinking?
I personally, I don't believe in that there is a great effect of the climate change itself, because there's a recycle and cycle of the world, and every tens of years, and that will finish after. But of course, we, as a group of countries, we are following what is being done through within the United Nations with the group of 77, China, and also other developing countries. All those countries, what's being agreed upon, we are following that, and also in our own countries, we are doing just to there are mitigations and adaptation for all those kinds of terminologies which deals with climate change issues, and we are doing that and following what's being agreed upon in the negotiations.
You're doing what you're doing internally,
yes.
Even as okay. So Eva wants to say something. I do want to say. So we have 15 minutes left, and please don't make me feel like we failed here. So I really hope that some of you have questions, and if you do have questions, I'm not sure what the protocol is, but are there microphones that are going to go around to the audience? And if there are, perhaps someone could hand a microphone to someone whose hand is up. But Eva, why don't you go ahead now?
Well, I don't need to remind you that every country that you represent is a signatory to the Climate Change Convention and a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. So all of those countries take the issue very seriously. I think the good thing in the negotiations is that we're beginning to adjust our expectations, that we're beginning to understand that we need a climate regime, an agreement for something different than perhaps we thought we needed it 15 or 20 years ago. So it's not going to help us to set very ambitious goals for every single country in the world. It is going to help us to create an operating mechanism around the economics, and that, I think, is a good development.
Great. Okay. So someone, sir, please, if you could just identify yourself as well, please.
Jawad Kardoudi, Institut marocain des relations internationales. Monsieur de Boer a émis une question très intéressante, à savoir que les prix des produits fossiles ne comprennent pas le coût des énergies sur l'environnement. Je crois que vraiment cette notion est extrêmement importante. Alors, partant du principe du pollueur-payeur, est-ce qu'on ne pourrait pas envisager une taxe sur les ventes des produits fossiles pour alimenter justement le fonds de l'environnement pour lutter contre les effets désastreux du changement climatique? J'aimerais avoir l'avis des membres du panel sur cette proposition. Merci.
So the question, if my French has served me well enough, is what do you think about a carbon tax? What do you think about the notion of changing the economics of the proposition such that you intensify the shift away from fossil fuels with an economic push? Who wants to jump in? Ivo, I think everyone wants to jump in. Go ahead.
Well, I think there were actually two questions there. One, or 2 points. One was the point, should we be more broadly internalizing environmental costs into the price of products? And I think my answer to that would be yes, absolutely. I have no problem with Europeans sitting in their bath eating strawberries in the middle of the winter, providing they pay the environmental costs of producing that strawberry in winter instead of passing it on to someone else. So yes, we need to internalize cost. Do I believe in a Tobin tax, which is what you're talking about, a global tax on carbon, which then goes to help address climate change in poor countries? I don't think that'll ever happen.
And to be clear, why? You don't think it should happen, or you don't think it will happen?
I don't think it will happen for political reasons. Nnimmo talked about the reluctance of people to put money into the Green Climate Fund. I think that countries will begin to tax pollution more for purposes of adjusting their own economy, but I don't think we're good enough humans yet to say let's put that into a common pool and use it for everyone's benefit.
Nnimmo and then Andreas.
Yeah, thank you. I believe firmly that, of course, the environmental costs should be internalized and that it should be part of the cost of fossil fuels. This would help to make the world move away from fossil fuel dependence because the cost will be extremely expensive. But beyond that, I think also that one thing that is missing in the climate negotiation is the notion of climate debt. Now, when we talk about common but differentiated responsibilities, the rich countries, industrialized countries have caused all the pollution, 80% of the space taken already, and now the 20% is now being debated who is going to pollute it. I think that the historical harm being done should be accounted for, and the rich countries should pay for that harm, because now the poor countries are struggling to keep their heads above water with the little resources they have, whereas somebody has already benefited from that. So that should be part of the cost, and then we can move forward from there.
Good. So, Andreas, I want you to jump in, but I just want to take moderator's privilege and as a marker, just note that any degree of hope that you have heard expressed on this panel is, I think, quickly being dashed by an element of reality. So you've heard people articulate that the 5 people on the ledge now feel like they need to jump together because if they don't, they'll suffer big consequences. And you've heard Nnimmo articulate the notion that one of those 5 people or a couple of them need to do more than the others do. And I dare say it's not too cynical to say that that's not a recipe for likely comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, among people. Not to say what it should or should not be, but I think you've articulated sort of exactly why we are at the point we are at in terms of the difficulty of these negotiations. Andreas, please.
Thank you. Here is an optimist who is battling with the realist side in himself. I think that this is solvable. We do have difficulties with political will and other factors. We will not have a global tax in order to tax fossil fuels and feed some international pot of money for 2 reasons. One is taxation requires representation, and we do not have democratic representation in international fora. The preconditions for legitimacy of taxation simply isn't there at the international level. Second, Germany is putting a lot of money into international cooperation, but it's mostly bilateral. It has something to do with the mistrust of large organizations and the bureaucracy that they create, and the lack of focus in targeting the expenditure afterwards. Third point is, before we talk about taxation, monsieur, let's talk about the subsidies. The world is still subsidizing, just the OECD, fossil fuels by $650 billion per year. Let's cut that first and then think about taxation.
Just again to be the skeptic for a moment, I just feel like it's my role in the moderator's chair. Among all the other subjects here on which there is fundamental disagreement, not just on this panel but in the world, is how one does the math that Andreas is talking about. What one considers a subsidy and not a subsidy. Apart from simply, even if one were to agree on that, whether subsidies for different things are good or bad. So the world can't even agree on where to have that discussion. I want to move on to other questions, please, in the front row here. And we're going to try to answer these more quickly so we can get through a few more questions in the time we've got.
Yes, hi, my name is Khalid Benamou. I'm the managing director of the Saharin project based in Morocco. And my question to the panel is addressed actually, we've seen when an energy or a commodity becomes strategic and gets the military backing, if you look at the energy transition, the way it's been done from coal to oil, it was because the Navy needed that oil, and then it became the focus. You look at the question that you look at the role of Saudi Arabia, for example, with the strategic reserves. So my question is, based upon renewables and upon the urgency of the climate issues, as we've seen with the typhoon in the Philippines, the military are always there in the first place, trying to rescue emergency situations. You did mention the military spending, Mr. BASSEY, in your intervention. That was very nice. We know how big the military spendings are. My question is, as you also mentioned the fact that both Japan and Germany are walking away from nuclear, as they do not have military programs around nuclear, and we've seen how nuclear has been championed essentially by the military, how can we make the military aware of the importance of renewable energy and an energy transition? That's my question.
So, yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, I think the military, at least certainly the military in the United States is aware. Yep. The military in the United States is very aware of the risk of climate change and of the need to transition into renewables because of the threat of being over-reliant on fossil fuels. So I think actually the military, certainly in the United States, is very much aware, would be my small answer to your question.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say as the American up here that I think that's true, and regardless of what one thinks ought to be the situation, I think it's fair to say there's a general sense in the United States that the military is perhaps the largest force that might be a market for these sorts of things for two reasons. One is because the military measures the cost of delivering oil to the front in terms of literally lives per gallon, not to mention dollars per gallon, which is in the hundreds of US dollars. And secondly, the military in the US is quite concerned about the viability of the American electrical grid. This is not the viability of an electrical grid in what's considered a developing country. It's in the United States, and the concern that the grid is so overburdened that the military needs things to pull it off the grid. Andreas, go ahead.
Yeah, the same is true also for nuclear power. I had the chance to ask approximately that question to General Wesley Clark only about 2 months ago, and his response was quite clear. The military is aware of the proliferation of nuclear technologies, nuclear materials, knowledge into countries that are either unstable or have links to non-state actors, meaning potential terrorists, and they know that the security policy price, the military price, the diplomatic price, generally, of containing the threat of nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands is very high. You just have to look at the negotiations with Iran at the moment and the possible consequences of that going wrong. An Iranian bomb, what will that mean for a Sunni bomb? What will that mean for an Egyptian bomb? There are all these domino effects when one country acquires nuclear weapons capability, and the American military are worried about the spreading of nuclear technology on the back of the civilian nuclear sector, for which there is no economic base anyway. It is all military to begin with. It's just organized in a very stupid way. Wesley Clark actually used a word that sounded like stupid when he gave the answer.
Nnimmo, please.
I was very intrigued some time ago when I learned that the American military has a lot of training and workshops on how to engage in environmentally friendly warfare. I think that means they must be concerned about renewables. Now, what I think, Jeff...
camouflage is green, right?
If I should just to tease you a little bit, I think if the U.S. becomes a democracy, that would solve some of these problems.
Other questions? We had a few hands up. Sure, right there, please. Yeah. And if we do this quickly, I think we've got time for one or two more.
My name is Adam. I'm a student in the preparatory classes of Tangier here. I have actually two questions. Since I actually like the metaphor of the 5 men standing on a ledge, how do you actually think that these four or actually 5 men can actually be motivated to jump off the ledge? How can we actually interest them in jumping? And then, how can we, all of us as global citizens, get involved in this green growth or sustainability? If you actually think that we should actually get involved and not be idle. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. Please, yeah, Evo.
Well, first of all, I didn't say 5 men on a ledge. I said 3 men and 2 ladies, or 3 ladies and 2 men. But I think one of the most important ways to motivate those people on that ledge is by creating trust, by creating trust amongst them that they take each other and their economic circumstances seriously, so that they're willing to address each other's concerns, including the concerns of oil-producing countries. So trust is one very important element. And secondly, the realization that, as Andreas was saying, it actually can be very attractive to jump off the ledge because there's something better at the bottom than there is at the top. So we need to create more confidence around the economic future. In terms of popular engagement, I talked about the Copenhagen hangover, the fact that this is off the agenda. I think that many politicians at the moment feel that they do not have popular backing to be very aggressive on climate change because people are worried about the economy. That's the perception of many politicians. So I think that many people, many ordinary people, should be out there joining movements like Nnimmo's movements to say to the politicians that you do care. Because politicians, at the end of the day, good politicians, go where the voters want them to go.
Who else wants to jump in on this question? I've been told in my ear that this is the last question. Yeah, Andreas.
One thing is those 5 people are already holding hands. The 5 people are already holding hands, and you could say that in many cases they actually have their wrists linked with handcuffs. Our economies, our nations are so integrated in so many ways that no one person can jump without pulling the others across, and nobody can stand up there whilst the others jump. We are too interlinked as peoples on the planet already. The second point is the experience we have in Germany, and I mentioned the PricewaterhouseCoopers study already, is that making the transition towards a low-carbon economy is actually economically beneficial. It creates new businesses, it creates new jobs. There are good jobs in various places. There are more jobs than you're destroying in other areas. The transition means that the fossil and the nuclear industry in Germany are going to shrink and die. Yes, there will be job losses there, but they're more than compensated by job growth elsewhere. People understand that there are lots of economic and social benefits from making that transition. So this is not jumping off the 20-story building. This is actually a very pleasurable water slide that ends you in a nice pool.
Abbas and Naqi, Nnimmo BASSEY, does either of you want to jump in on this question and have a last word, or are you all set? You okay? Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much. I clearly, two quick points. If there's a name for this panel, this is the five person on the ledge panel. And the other point is, I think if you're more confused now than you were when you came, we have accomplished our task. Obviously, there are no easy solutions here, and indeed, one dichotomy that perhaps you've detected is a general sense that there is a broader sense on the part of the world that the world should need to do something on climate change. You've heard articulated here the expectation that people feel that way, but I think you've also heard articulated here no one can really figure out how those 5 people all jump together, even though plenty of people here think that they should jump together. That's probably a pretty good metaphor for where the world is on this. I see someone with a microphone. I'd love to have another question, but I've been told we're out of time. There will be much more discussion of energy at this conference going forward, including a panel next. Yes.
J'ai juste des petites questions très simples, 2-3 petites questions très simples, très simples. Parce que là, je représente un groupe d'étudiants basé ici dans une école de commerce. Et je voudrais, s'il vous plaît, que l'on montre qu'est-ce qui commande chaque fois. Est-ce que c'est les politiques qui dirigent l'économie ou des lobbies, des groupes de pression commerciaux qui dirigent la politique? Voilà pour un petit point. Un autre petit point, s'il vous plaît, que je voudrais que vous éclairiez juste rapidement. Qu'est-ce qui fait le danger? Qu'est-ce qui fait le danger, s'il vous plaît, donc du nucléaire en Iran? Si c'était par exemple un autre pays, est-ce que les groupes, les 5 plus 1, est-ce qu'ils agiraient autrement?
Okay, so we can actually address both of those questions in a panel on renewable energy that comes next. One of the questions was, does politics push the economy, or does the economy push politics? I don't think that's a 30-second question, but it's absolutely an important one. Come to the next panel and we'll address it there. I hate to do this, but I've been told that we're going to be run off the stage if we don't shift to the next panel. So thank you very much. Thank you all very much, and thank you very much.